Welcome to the Chapter 40 lecture. This is the first lecture of the ecology unit, where we'll talk about biomes, both terrestrial biomes and aquatic biomes, and then talk about how organisms interact with one another, as well as interact with the environment, and how those interactions influence how species are distributed, which is just kind of a fancy way of saying how organisms and why organisms live in some places and not others. And then we'll pick up in class with section 40.4. So the purpose behind this video is just to make up for that snow day we had right before spring break. So ecology really is one of my favorite topics. In fact, my master's work was in physiological ecology and understanding how the environment where an organism lives impacts the physiology of that organism and vice versa, to be honest. And so I really like thinking about ecology because it incorporates so many different aspects of an organism. It's very interdisciplinary. And that's what this statement over here is saying. Let me get my pen. Here we go. That's what this statement over here is saying, is that, species extinction rates change and are much higher when there's ecological stress. And ecological stress can be environmental, it can be other organisms. But the more risk occurs in populations where they have very little genetic diversity. So then this goes back to what we learned about genetics back in Unit 4, but then also what we learned about evolution in Unit 6, with just all of this kind of coming together with things about macromolecules and chemical cycles and all those things come together. Our fun little frog here is a harlequin toad, native to Costa Rica and Panama. It is highly threatened by fungus, and one of the things about amphibians is that they don't have scales. Those are reptiles and birds. They don't have feathers. Those are birds. They don't have skin coverings like hair, like mammals have, and so they're very sensitive to changes in their environment, and they get sick a lot. And one of the more recent dangers to amphibians is fungus, and so that's kind of an interesting problem that we're noticing with amphibians that live in Middle America. So in general, and this is what I was saying earlier, ecology is that scientific study of the interactions between organisms and the environment. So we can talk about organism versus organism interactions, we can talk about organism versus environment interactions, but ecology is about how things interact. There are lots of different levels of study, and I'm going to show you these next. All right, so from big to little, or top to bottom, however you want to think about it, global ecology, landscape ecology, ecosystem ecology, this is the one that we tend to think of when we think about ecology, community ecology, population ecology, and organismal ecology. And so on this slide, I'm just giving you examples of different investigative and scientific questions that could be examples of that kind of ecological research. So when we talk global ecology, it's about ocean circulations and currents, landscapes. It's about what is the physical space and what does that look like. Ecosystem ecology is looking at all of the different organisms and abiotic features of that environment. Community ecology is only about organisms, not the abiotic features like we had up in ecosystem. Population is a single species. All the individuals of a single species are part of a population. And then organismal ecology is just looking at one individual organism and trying to learn about it. And so take a second and read those questions. That bottom question down here is what I did my master's thesis on. And so I was an organismal ecologist. Ecological physiology is what the branch of science was called, and that's what I studied for 2 years. So, in order for us to talk about ecology, and like I said, ecology is about interactions, we do need to start by talking very basically about climate. Where does climate come from? How is it, created based on our place in space? And then we'll move on to talking about how organisms can influence things too. So, many of you skipped right over earth science in your studies at Grandview High School. Some of you were taking CP physical science when we did a little bit of earth science, but even in that class, very little. And so we have to do a little bit of down and dirty about climate and seasons and where it comes from in order for you guys to have a better understanding of ecology. So there are actually really good diagrams in your textbook, and so if this is the kind of thing that interests you and you think I've gone too fast, you probably are going to want to take a few minutes and look to your textbook on pages 820 and 821. That'll tell you a little bit more about the earth science theories that go into climate. So climate, by definition, is the long-term prevailing weather conditions in a given area, and this is what has the most significant influence on the distribution of organisms. There are 4 components of climate, and when we talk about this, these are abiotic, so these are non-abiotic, non-living factors. Temperature, precipitation, sunlight, and wind, which is kind of interesting. Obviously, temperature and sunlight are going to be pretty closely related, but just because someplace is sunny doesn't necessarily mean it's hot, and vice versa. And so, you want to kind of keep those separate in your head, the ideas behind temperature and sunlight. So we also have biotic factors, separate from those abiotic factors, biotic factors that are also influencing distribution and abundance. So what that means is that there are other organisms, be those plants or animals or fungi or bacteria or anything that are part of an individual's environment. So we call macroclimate here, macroclimate is the climate and the global, regional, and landscape levels. So this is hugely influenced by Earth's geography. So when we talk about earth science here, this is what we're talking about, macroclimate. So Earth's geography, the tilt of the planet's axis, bodies of water, mountain ranges, things like that. Why is it, for example, on the eastern slope of the Rocky Mountains, we tend to say we live in a rain shadow, whereas on the western slope, they tend to have a lot more precipitation? Well, it's the body of, or the mountain range that separates the east from the west that really is influencing how much precipitation actually makes it over those mountains. So that's what's changing the macroclimate of those areas. So we're going to look at these just real quickly. So first, the Earth's shape, of course, it's round. There's variation in the intensity of sunlight that arrives at the different areas of our planet. And so if you imagine that the sun is over here, shining this way, well, the same amount of sunlight is far more concentrated here, and it's far more spread out at the poles. Okay, so you can think about that as heat and light per unit area being delivered, being far more concentrated here and far less concentrated up and down. So the sunlight that strikes the Earth at these 2 locations is striking at an oblique angle, so the heat and the light are more diffuse. And so when I was saying earlier, we have to keep the amount of sunlight and the temperature separate, this is a feature of that, because, it doesn't seem like there's less light here, but that angle of striking the planet is much more oblique, which is why we end up actually having much lower temperatures. So when those intense solar rays hit the equator, that sunlight then initiates a pattern of air circulation and precipitation. And simultaneously, the Earth is rotating on its axis. So what that means is that the air here, the equator, is moving much, much, much faster than the air at our poles. So let's think about why that would be. If we go out to the track, I'll even draw a track. We go out to the track. You have an inside lane and an outside lane. That's a really ugly track, but I have limited tools to work with. But if we have people starting here and here, and they start at the same time, and they make their lap, the inside and the outside person, they started at the same time, and they finished at the same time, who's running faster? Well, in the same amount of time, this person out here has covered a lot more distance, so this person had to run much faster than this person in order for them to start and end at the same time. Well, that's in essence what's happening here. The globe is spinning as a unit, and so as it spins, this part of the planet is moving way faster than this part of the planet because there's a much greater distance that has to be covered. So that's what this is saying. Land near the equator is moving faster than at the poles. So what happens as a result of this, is that we have what are called easterly and westerly flows. So literally, the planet is pulling the air around it like this. You can see it coming this way, I hope. And so it's pulling the air around, and that's causing these shifts in wind flow. Then, meanwhile, all of this is happening. We have ascending air, so air that climbs releases moisture because it cools down, and cooler air holds less moisture, so it drops. But then as it moves up, it will fall again. This is just a simple convection current, cools and then falls again as the warm air over here rises. So we end up with these convection currents, and as it falls, it absorbs some moisture. So what ends up happening is that we have these bands of drier air and these bands of wetter air. And if you look at the whole planet together, that's where you're going to see desert areas in these arid zones and tropical rainforests in these wetter zones. So then, of course, we also have seasons. The seasons are a result of Earth being tilted on its axis. And so you may or may not know that the Earth is always tilted at 23.5 degrees, and that's what this diagram is showing you from the vertical. Okay. And so what happens as a result is that the intensity of solar radiation varies seasonally. If there was no tilt, if we were straight up and down north and south, then we would not have seasons. This variation in seasonality is smallest in the tropics and is most extreme at the poles. And that's why if you've ever been to the North Pole, or the South Pole, but I think the North Pole is probably more likely, in the North Pole, it is summer, the daylight in summer, for almost 24 hours a day, more like 22 hours a day, versus in the winter when it's dark for 22 hours a day. You don't have that kind of variation in the tropics because you're not ever leaned so far toward for the summer and so far away over here for the winter that no matter what the season is, you're actually not really moving that far in difference to where the sun is. But that tilt on the axis is what's actually causing seasons. And then, of course, we also have currents. So you may have heard that if you flush the toilet in Australia, it goes counterclockwise. Now, I don't actually know if that's true, although I do have a friend in Australia. I could call her and ask her. But what ends up happening, and what you're seeing here, is that north of the equator, all of our currents go like this. So what does that mean? Well, what that means is that the water that's here is coming down from this cold area, and the water that's here is coming up from this warm area. So when we talk about macroclimate, we're talking about what are these global patterns that we're looking at that are going to influence the distribution of organisms. So currents influence climates along the coasts. And how do they do that? It's the properties of water. They can heat or cool overlying air masses that pass. And because of that high specific heat of water, the oceans and the lakes tend to moderate the temperature of the nearby land. Mountains, the impact of mountain ranges are pretty significant. They can really impact how air flows over land, and we know this because we live in a rain shadow. And so what happens is water flows in over the ocean, or air flows in over the ocean containing water, and it moderates these temperatures near the shore. So that's why places like LA and San Diego, it doesn't matter whether it's December or June, have very stable temperatures because they're right there next to the water. But then as that air hits a mountain range and that air comes up, the air flows upward and cools at these higher altitudes and releases all of that water as rain or snow. So then on the other side of this mountain, as the air comes back down, there's really just not an awful lot less moisture left in that air that gets to this other side. And so that's why you call it a rain shadow. It creates almost a desert on the backside of a mountain range. So that's what we call a rain shadow. Mountains can do some other things. They can affect the amount of sunlight, that should say reaching, not reading, reaching an area and the local temperature. South-facing versus north-facing slopes. South-facing slopes will get a lot of sun. North-facing slopes, not so much. And then temperatures go down. So a 1,000-meter gain in elevation has a 6 degrees Celsius temperature drop. And this is true no matter where you are on the planet. It doesn't matter if you're at the equator. As you gain in elevation, you drop some temperatures as well. So now we're going to talk about biomes. And if you took CP Bio or you took Honors Bio, you have learned your biomes. You might need a refresher, but you have learned your biomes. I gave you a handout in class, a little note-taking grid, and I'm not going to go through all of these with you because, well, it should be review for most of you. It's a good idea to go into your textbook. The terrestrial biomes are on pages 824 through 826, and then the aquatic biomes are on 827 through 829. You do not need to know everything it says in your textbook, not even close. I would say that you need to pick one terrestrial biome and know it well. You need to pick one aquatic biome and know it well, but then you also need to be able to recognize all of them. Okay, so kind of keep that in mind. Don't feel like you have to know every word on every page, but if somebody says northern coniferous forest, you need to, in your head, be able to picture what that is. Okay, so what is a biome? A biome is a major life zone, so a region that is characterized by a type of vegetation, that's true for your terrestrial biomes, or by the physical environment, and that's true for your aquatic biomes. So since climate shows very strong latitudinal patterns, so do locations of terrestrial biomes. And so on our planet, we tend to see side-to-side patterns of biomes rather than up and down patterns. And that's just because our climate shows latitudinal patterns. The two abiotic factors that are most important in the distribution of a biome are mean temperature and mean precipitation. Those are two biggies. So this is what the biomes look like. And so now, like I was saying earlier, we, for the most part, have this left to right pattern of where we see our biomes. There are some exceptions. The dark gray. And that's because that's where we have mountain ranges. And so that comes back to earth science again, where we tend to have a convergent plate boundary where we have two plates that are driving into each other. And when they do that, they tend to form mountains. And so the exception to the kind of the side-to-side patterns of biome distribution are going to be those mountain ranges. That's what we tend to see there. So this next diagram, you'll notice it's blank, and normally I don't do that to you guys. But this next diagram is called a climograph. And on a climograph, we have an x-axis that represents precipitation, and we have a y-axis that represents temperature. So here is temperature, and then this is precipitation. And so when we look at this, here are your options over here on the left. Okay, those are all the different types of biomes. And so I'd like for you guys to try to figure out, okay, can I sort through where each of these 6 different biomes would fit on my climograph? And reason through this. Think, okay, where would I have this much precipitation and this kind of a temperature? What would I get here? What about over here? This one's going to be your easiest, because notice we have pretty warm temperatures but almost no precipitation. That's going to be your desert. So now what I'd like you guys to try to do is see if you can figure out where these other ones would go. I'm just going to pause for a second so you can pause the video. All right, let's see if you figured it out properly. So like I told you earlier, this is the desert. It's one of the easiest ones to figure out because it's got the least amount of precipitation consistently. This is the coldest one, so I'm going to cross desert off. We got desert. Okay, this is the coldest one, so I'm going to call the coldest one the Arctic and Alpine tundra. Okay, that makes sense too. This one has a ton of precipitation and is very warm, so that's going to be my tropical rainforest. And here we just call it tropical forest. Okay, so that's going to be the ones we know as the tropical rainforest. We're left with 3. We have our temperate grasslands, broadleaf forests, and northern coniferous forests. Well, north tends to be colder, so if I look at my temperature, that one right there is going to be my northern coniferous forest. And then I have these 2 left, one of which is going to be a grassland, and one of which is going to be a forest. Well, which one's going to need more water? The forest is going to need more water. This one has more precipitation. That's going to be your temperate broadleaf forest. This one's going to be your temperate grassland. So the reason I wanted you guys to see this was because there's a good chance you could get a graph like this on your test and have to reason through maybe not necessarily the name of the biome, but maybe what kind of organisms could live there, what kind of challenges could be present for the organisms that live there, those kinds of things. So just realize that even if you get something that's not labeled, you can think through what you see and just use patterns from your own personal experience to kind of figure out what's going on. So climate graphs, however, have some limitations. They don't take into account patterns of climatic variation, and those patterns can be just as important as averages. So that's why some of those biomes on that previous diagram overlapped. So think about it. If you have a wet season and a dry season, and maybe it doesn't rain for 6 months of the dry season, well, that's going to impact how the organisms are able to live there. In contrast to that, an area that has the exact same annual average precipitation might get a little bit of rain year round, and that's going to very much influence the biomes and the organisms that can live there. We can also have disturbances that can alter the distributions of those biomes, such as how frequently do fires happen. And then we have terrestrial environments that usually grade into one another. There's not a fence that separates any of the land masses or any of the areas from one thing into the next. There's always this kind of intergradation of the two areas, and we call that an ecotone, where we slowly move from a grassland into a forest or from a grassland into the mountains and whatnot. So just like I was saying earlier, what you need to do is choose one terrestrial biome and know it well. And then there's the pages again in case you missed them when I said them. All right, so let's move into those aquatic biomes. Aquatic biomes show far less latitudinal variation than the terrestrial ones. The aquatic biomes can be freshwater, which are no salt or very little salt, or marine. And I always feel like, I've been to the ocean a few times in my life, and I always feel like the water is so salty. It's actually only about 3% salt for the most part, which is kind of a low number, it seems to me, but that's what it is. The freshwater biomes are very closely linked to the soils of the surrounding terrestrial biome. And then they're also impacted by the pattern and the speed of the water flow, as well as the climate. Oceans, of course, make up the largest biome. Oceans cover about 75%, 3/4 of your surface. Oceans provide for you in huge ways. They give you rainfall, so water evaporates off the oceans, goes into the clouds, and then falls again on our continents. They change global climate and wind patterns, like we were talking about earlier, and provide us with marine algae that produce a ton of oxygen and take in an awful lot of carbon dioxide. And then, of course, we eat a lot of things that come out of the ocean, and those things are delicious. So aquatic biomes are divided into different zones. We have vertical as well as horizontal zones. This is just kind of a quick down and dirty. You have the photic versus the aphotic zone. Photic means light, and so the photic zone is where there is enough light for photosynthesis. The aphotic zone is where there's not enough light for photosynthesis, so that's good. Then we have the littoral and the limnetic zones, which are just talking about how close are you to shore. So littoral is close to shore, limnetic is far from shore. And then we have the pelagic zone and the benthic zone. And the pelagic zone is the water, and then the benthic zone is the sediment, so like the kind of the gross stuff at the bottom. So those are your 6 main zones, and then we also have what's called a thermocline, and most of you have probably experienced a thermocline because, even in the reservoirs around here, you can feel a thermocline. A thermocline separates the warm upper layer and the cold deeper layer, and the seasons can impact where that thermocline kind of hits. But if you've ever been in the water and it's like warm, and then all of a sudden it's freezing, that's the thermocline. You found it. So interactions between organisms and the environment limit the distributions of a species. So this is going to be our only real topic for today where ecology is actually involved, and we're going to talk about distributions of species. So a distribution is just where the species lives. And that distribution is the consequence of both ecological and evolutionary impacts over time. And just to go back to what we talked about in Unit 6, the differential survival and reproduction of individuals that led to evolutionary change occur in ecological time. Those minute-to-minute interactions between organisms and the environment. So we talked before about fitness and survival of the fittest. All of this that we talked about, and then we kind of talk about it in terms of alleles and P's and Q's and dominant and recessive and all that kind of jazz. It all comes down to these interactions in ecological time. Can these organisms find food? Can these organisms find shelter? How are they predisposed to these things? So as we go through ecology, evolution and the survival and fitness aspects are really closely interrelated. So here's a question I actually want you to pause the video and think about, because in class I would have had you talk to your neighbors, but you're not in class. Why don't all organisms on the planet live everywhere? Why don't we have polar bears that live with the black bears in Rocky Mountain National Park? Why don't we have kangaroos? In contrast, why aren't there raccoons in Australia, right? So we have very clear differences in the fauna and flora in the different biomes across the planet. Why don't they all live everywhere? So pause the video and I want you to actually think about that for a second. So now we're going to talk about a couple different things that can influence where we find organisms. Dispersal is a big one. Dispersal is the movement of individuals or gametes. And when we talk about gametes, think mostly like seeds and dandelions and the wind carrying seeds away. So dispersal is the movement of individuals or gametes away from their area of origin or from centers of high population density. So that's dispersal. The role of dispersal of organisms is critical to understanding this whole concept of geographic isolation and evolution. Remember that geographic isolation was one of the ways that we could get to speciation. And a lot of that geographic isolation comes from dispersal. Dispersal also helps us understand these broad patterns of species that we see around the world. So why don't we have kangaroos in Colorado? They probably could live here, but they can't get here by themselves. They wouldn't be able to swim across the ocean. It'd be quite an undertaking for a kangaroo. But if enough of them got loose here in Colorado out of the zoo, nobody took note, which seems a little unusual, but if it happened, they might be able to survive. But the trick is they can't get here. If dispersal, the ability to get there, doesn't limit distribution, what does? So let's suggest for something simpler, like our polar bear. Polar bears could presumably walk from Canada to Colorado, and yet they haven't. Why not? Why don't we have polar bears in Colorado? Well, that's when we get into these abiotic and biotic factors that limit the ability of those organisms to be successful in this space. So, as ecologists study the factors limiting distribution, they consider this series of questions. It's very flowchart-like. And so if you've written any code, computer code, oftentimes, or at least when I wrote code, it always started with a flowchart. And so this flowchart always reminds me of coding. So the question is, why is species X absent from this area? Can they get there? Does dispersion limit distribution? And if the answer is yes, then the area is just inaccessible. They can't get there. Or they haven't had enough time to get there, which is sometimes the case as well. But if dispersal is not the issue, what are the other limits? Are they biotic factors that are limiting distribution? If so, here are some options: predation, parasitism, competition, and disease. And if the answer is none of those things are limiting distribution, maybe there are abiotic factors that are limiting distribution. Abiotic factors fall into one of two categories: chemical and physical. Chemical factors are literally available chemicals: water, oxygen, salinity. Physical factors are things like temperature, light, soil, and whatnot. So these are the kinds of questions. It's got to be limited somehow. So organisms are either limited by their dispersion, limited by biotic factors, or limited by abiotic factors. If not for one of those three, we would have all organisms in all spaces. Biotic factors are those that involve other species. And I said that before. And so predation and herbivory, those are factors that are going to restrict an organism's ability to survive and reproduce. That will negatively impact an organism's fitness. But then we can also have other species that can act as a limitator because they are either absent or their competitors are present. Things like lack of pollinators. Maybe the absence of bees prevents a particular species of flower from being in an area, not because they can't get there, but because once they get there, they can't have baby flowers. Maybe there's just not enough food, okay? Which, remember, we eat organic things, so that is going to be a biotic factor. Maybe there are parasites or pathogens that these particular organisms aren't able to compete with. Or maybe there's already competing organisms there. Something has already taken advantage of the niche that this new organism would fill. And so these biotic factors are the ones that involve other species that can restrict the ability of new organisms in that space. So here's an example. Does feeding by sea urchins limit seaweed distribution? So here what they're looking at is, so this is a sea urchin, he's pokey, don't ever grab one, that hurts. Here's a limpet, it's kind of like a snail with a funny looking shell. Both of these are herbivores, so we'll keep that in mind. Interestingly, what this is looking at is how much seaweed is in a particular space when we do different things. So the control is that red line, and that control is saying, well, both urchins and limpets are removed, or are present rather. We have very little seaweed. Well, that makes sense because they're herbivores, they're eating the seaweed. If we take out both limpets and urchins, tons of seaweed. If we remove only urchins, tons of seaweed. But if we remove only limpets, look at what happens. We're still down here with almost none. So what is this telling us? What's telling us that the organisms, the seaweed, the sea urchin, and the limpet, are all interacting in this space in order to have some kind of an ecological balance. That's what this is telling us, is that really, if you take out the urchins, if you take out these guys, the limpets can't eat enough, well, to keep the population down. But if you only take out the limpets, the urchins are going to eat so much that not much is going to be growing down there at the bottom. So it's all a very interesting interaction, and it's an interesting balance that these organisms have struck. Abiotic factors can also greatly influence distribution. If the physical factors at a particular site don't allow a species to survive and reproduce, then the species isn't going to be there. Temperature is a great example. Temperature, as we know, affects literally all biological processes. Most organisms function best within a very specific range of temperature. If it's outside that range, the organism's probably not going to be very, very likely to survive. Water and oxygen is another biggie. Variation in water availability in different habitats is hugely limiting to the distribution of species. Organisms that are adapted to the desert are not going to thrive in a rainforest and vice versa. Similarly, oxygen availability is kind of the water of the ocean, if you will. Oxygen availability in aquatic environments is of huge consequence. There are organisms that are adapted to oxygen-poor waters, just like there are organisms adapted to deserts. So how that oxygen availability changes in environments can very much influence distribution. Salinity is another example. Salt concentration will impact the distribution of species. Available sunlight. Sunlight, of course, is necessary for photosynthetic organisms. Too little can limit the distribution of plant life, but so can too much. There are plants that are adapted to shaded areas. Rocks and soil. We don't often think of dirt as having a lot of variety, but the dirt has a lot of organisms in it, as well as a lot of chemicals in it that organisms need to make their macromolecules. So on land, the pH and mineral composition can limit the distribution of plants and therefore animals that feed on them as well. So all of these features fit into understanding how organisms are distributed into different environments, and why we don't find polar bears in Colorado and penguins in, let's say, Northern Europe. it's this distribution that is impacted by both abiotic and biotic factors. So I hope you've learned something today. Feel free to reference that textbook in order to make sure that you're up to speed, where we'll pick up with Chapter 40, Section 4 in the lecture. And hopefully you'll be ready to go with that. So thanks for watching. Have a great day.